Good evening, everybody. My name is Sandra Hayes from Teagasc. I'd like to welcome you here to the Germinal webinar on maximising the potential of white and red clover. We have two speakers here this evening. Our first speaker on white clover will be Dr. Mary McEvoy, who works with Germinal, and our second speaker is Diarmuid Murphy, who will be doing a presentation on the red clover. We really welcome any questions that you have, and as you can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box, and you can put your questions in there while the presentation is going on. So if there's any questions that I think Mary or Dermot will be able to answer while the presentations are going on, I'll stop them and ask your questions. So you can post them there with your name, or you can post them there anonymously. It doesn't make any difference. And we'll try and get through and answer all those questions. If I don't get through them during the presentation, we'll have a round of question and answers at the end of our session. So without further ado, I'd like to transfer over to yourself, Mary, and if you want to start with the presentation.
Thanks very much, Sandra. And just to say thanks to Sandra once again for chairing the webinars. And we'd like to welcome all our viewers here this evening. As Sandra said, we hope you find it useful and beneficial in terms of your understanding of both the management of both red and white clover. And again, as Sandra said, if you have any questions, please put them up as we go along, and we'll try to deal with them as much as we can as we go along. So to begin with this evening, I'm going to talk about white clover. I suppose white clover is the Latin name Trifolium repens. The tri is tree and folium is leaf, so that's where the name comes from. So we've seen renewed interest in white clover in recent years, and this is coming from a combination of both a higher quality forage, where we have clover included in our swards, and also the nitrogen fixation benefit of grass white clover pastures. This improvement in terms of the nitrogen fixation benefit from white clover is a means to reducing the economic and environmental costs of our pasture-based milk production and meat production systems. The EU Farm to Fork strategy is targeting a reduction in fertiliser use by 20% by the year 2030. And I suppose, white clover is seen as one of the key tools in terms of how we'll actually achieve this reduction in artificial fertiliser use. We know where we have white clover in the swards, we see a benefit in terms of sward quality. We don't tend to see a drop off in terms of dry matter yield, even at lower levels of nitrogen input. And we see improvements in terms of animal performance as well. And obviously since 2020, there has been a requirement for farmers in irrigation to include white clover in their pastures when reseeding. So that requirement is for 1 kilo of coated white clover or 0.6 of a kilo of naked white clover to be included when you're doing a full reseed.
That's great. Just that on that benefit there that you have, Mary, the 150 kilograms of nitrogen, that is equivalent to about 4.4 bags of CAN, 27% nitrogen fertilizer. So it's quite significant what the little white clover plant can do.
Yeah, absolutely, Sandra. And I suppose we'll talk about it as we go through the presentation as well. But in order to achieve that level of nitrogen fixation, it is dependent on a number of factors, including the portion of clover in the sward, the soil temperatures, and also the amount of fertilizer nitrogen that is being applied. So in order for clover to do what it needs to do, I suppose we're trying to target a proportion of 20 to 25% clover in the sward to achieve that level of nitrogen fixation.
Great, thanks, Mary.
In terms of the animal production benefits, this work was completed by Mike Egan in Teagasc Moor Park, and it's well published work at this stage. And here he compared a grass-only sward at 250 kilos of nitrogen to a grass clover sward at 150 kilos of nitrogen. Okay, so he saw no difference in terms of total dry matter yield in terms of herbage production between the two treatments, despite the fact 100 kilos less nitrogen was going into the grass clover sward. They did see a benefit in terms of milk yield and also in terms of milk solids yield. And I suppose, this is has highlighted one of the strengths of clover in terms of its ability to feed nitrogen into the system, and also to have a positive effect in terms of animal performance. And in order to, I suppose, achieve that level, and get benefits out of clover in our swards, we need to be targeting about 20 to 25% clover across the year, and that's an average. So that'll vary from somewhat lower than that in the spring to a higher proportion later in the year. Obviously, we do know that Clover doesn't do much for us in the spring. It needs higher temperatures than grass to kick off and start growing. So, you know, there is often a bit of a deficit in terms of the feed availability on farms that have a lot of clover in the spring, and this needs to be offset by the introduction of either concentrate or silage. And I suppose this was highlighted in Mike Egan's work as well. You know, there was a higher requirement of silage to be fed to the cows on the grass clover sward at 150 kilos of nitrogen compared to the sward at 250 kilos of nitrogen. Work by Philip Creighton at Teagasc and Rye, looking at sheep performance of white clover swords. In this treatment trial, they compared 2 treatments, one with grass only at 145 kilos of nitrogen versus a grass clover at 90 kilos of nitrogen. Both treatments had a stocking rate of 11 ewes per hectare. And again, you know, there was no difference in terms of herbage production reported between the two treatments. And again, you know, even at lower level nitrogen, clover is doing a lot of work in terms of feeding the sward, fixing the nitrogen, and maintaining grass production across the year. He did find reduced days to slaughter with lambs on the grass clover sward, and you know, that led to improved gross margin in the sheep production system. And I suppose it's fair to say, you know, we do see similar results, you know, repeated across other trials in Ireland and also further afield in terms of the inclusion of grass clover, improving both the economic and environmental sustainability of pasture-based meat and milk production systems. And, you know, I think going forward, as you know, we're probably going to face into a scenario where we might be limited in terms of the amount of nitrogen we can apply. You know, clover really does have a lot to offer to the system. So in terms of nitrogen fixation, and we mentioned already that clover can fix up to 150 kilos of nitrogen, and I suppose how does clover actually fix this nitrogen? So clover has small swellings on the roots, and these are called nodules. Soil bacteria, which are known as rhizobia bacteria, live in these nodules. And if you dig up a clover plant, you may be actually able to see some of these nodules. They're little white nodules, and we'll show them on a slide in a minute. Now clover won't fix nitrogen probably for the first 12 months. First it puts down a taproot, and after about 12 months is when it starts to actively fix nitrogen in the sward. When the bacteria are fixing nitrogen, these nodules are reddish pink in colour, and that's how you know when nitrogen fixation is taking place. So what these bacteria do is they take nitrogen gas from the air, they convert it to a form of nitrogen, and this is then used by the plant for growth. The amount of nitrogen which is fixed by the sward is dependent on a number of factors, as I've just mentioned. These include the clover content or the clover proportion in the sward, the amount of nitrogen fertiliser being applied. You know, where we have more fertiliser being applied to the sward, you know, the clover essentially gets lazy and less nitrogen fixation happens by the clover plant. And also soil temperature. So, you know, soil temperatures need to be kind of above 8 degrees for clover to be actively growing, actively working, and fixing nitrogen for us as well. So there's a few dependencies for clover to be working in terms of nitrogen fixation on our farms. So this is a young plant. You know, firstly, when clover starts to get established first, I suppose it puts down a taproot, and you can see the ball root here, which this will eventually disappear, and the plant will then sustain itself through stoloniferous growth, which is, I suppose, how essentially we all talk about clover growing. It grows in stolons across the ground. So the stolon is the horizontal stem, seen here in the picture. If you can see that there. So it's moving out to the left and to the right of the plant here. And once the plant becomes established, the tip of that stolon becomes the growing point of the plant. The petiole then is the stalk here from which the leaf grows up off the stolon. And along the stolon here, you can see some small nodes in between the leaf stalks. These nodes, where these nodes touch the ground, this is where the plant is capable of producing what we call the adventitious root. And essentially this anchors the clover plant to the ground and allows it to extend its growth on and on. And that's essentially how it grows through its stolons. We do see, I suppose it's fair to say, Sandra, in some situations where clover is included in silage swords, the clover can actually dominate and take over the sward. And essentially this
that's actually a question that has actually come in there now, that you've just hit the nail on the head, Mary.
Okay, so essentially the reason why clover will dominate in a silage sward is we're cutting our silage swords so tight. So we're opening up the sward. Grass can take quite grass can take quite a while to recover after a tight cut of silage. And when that's happening, I suppose, because we haven't cut the stolons of the clover to the same extent, the stolons can throw up its petiole. It doesn't have to go up as far in order to get above the grass, because grass is just stubble there. So that the leaf of the clover doesn't have to grow up as high on the petiole. So it can capture light much easier and can start to take over the sward and smother out the grass in that regard. And I suppose, you know, it is fair to say we generally wouldn't recommend for people are sown silage fields to include clover in those mixtures, but for farmers in irrigation, even when they are sown silage ground, they need to include clover there, and that's important to remember. And I suppose if we compare the tight cutting and silage compared to, you know, where we're removing essentially all the leaf off the grass plant, and compare that to grazing, where we usually leave, you know, a remnant of grass leaf behind us. So then the grass can regrow that little bit quicker after a grazing, and that's why it's better able to compete with clover in grazing swards. And it tends to not dominate in grazing swards to the same extent that it can often dominate in silage swards.
Thanks, Mary.
This is some more work which was conducted in Teagasc, and I suppose it's just looking at the effect of clover on dry matter yield. And firstly, if we just look at the grass only treatment, and we see basically when we go from 0 kilos of nitrogen up to 250 kilos of nitrogen, that's what you're seeing there across the bottom of the screen. So going from 0, if you can see it there, to 60, 120, 200 and 250 kilos of nitrogen. As we increase the amount of nitrogen applied, we're seeing a response in terms of growth rate. So where we have 0 nitrogen being applied, the growth rate's about 9 tons, and that increases by about 3.5 tons where we have 250 kilos of nitrogen applied. So when we have grass only in the sward, we see a good response to fertiliser nitrogen. In this treatment, they also had grass clover swards, or in this trial, they also had grass clover swards. And when clover was included, you know, even at no nitrogen, artificial nitrogen going into the system, we saw a huge lift in terms of total dry matter production in that scenario. So where we had no nitrogen with the grass only, we were producing 9 tons of dry matter yield. Where we had grass clover swards with no nitrogen, this increased to 13 tons of dry matter yield. So again, we're seeing a massive lift where we have clover in the sward in terms of its ability to fix nitrogen, feed the plant, and maintain a high level of herbage production. And in this trial, you know, they did report clover content was highest at the 0 nitrogen treatment at about 35%, and lowest at 250 kilo of nitrogen treatment at about 20%. And you know, this is what we do see out in farms. You know, farmers will often say, you know, that the clover isn't lasting. They're not seen as much in the sward where there's a high level of nitrogen going into the system, and that's essentially, I suppose, we're driving the grass on. The clover, you know, doesn't have the same ability to compete where there's a lot of nitrogen in the system, and it doesn't perform as well or last as long in those swards.
Okay, just before you go on to the next slide, I just have a kind of a question on that. Brendan asked, why does white clover die off some swards for no reason? He's an organic farmer and has no nitrogen used.
Yeah, so I suppose there can be various reasons for that. Like clover, you know, it does like good fertile soils, so it's probably even fussier than grass. You know, clover likes, you know, a pH of say 6.5 or 6.3 at least, 6.5 or even slightly above that again. And you know, it does need a good P&K index there as well. So you know, we wouldn't. We'd always be advising if you're going to include clover into your mixtures, you know, you do need a relatively good status in terms of your soil fertility and pH before you go introducing clover. You know, as I said already, I suppose, you know, how we graze and how animals graze, they can actually often tear up that adventitious root that I described in terms of the stoloniferous growth, and this can thin out clover in swards as well. So you know, there are. And I suppose, look, it's probably fair to say there are some instances where, you know, you can have 2 fields side by side, exact same management across both, and you know, clover do better in one than the other. So there are some unknowns probably with clover in terms of why it lasts better in some swards and in some fields compared to others.
Great, thanks, Mary.
So in terms of clover type, I suppose, you know, we tend to categorize clover varieties based on their leaf size. We have small, medium, and large leaf clovers. We generally recommend small leaf clovers in sheep production systems, and small leaf clovers tend to be the most persistent of the clovers. but also the lower yielding of the clovers. So an example of this in the recommended list would be Aberrace. Medium leaf clovers are more suited to dairy cows or cattle grazing. They're in between, I suppose, in terms of both persistency and yield. An example of these would be Aberhurl and Putty on the current recommended list. And large leaf clovers, which we virtually have no use of large leaf clovers in Ireland anymore. And it was probably fair to say the large leaf clovers probably gave clover a bad name a number of years ago, where we really see a lot of shading out of grass and clover smothering out grass and having big bare patches and fields in the spring. And a lot of that would probably be associated with large leaf clovers. They're the least persistent, highest in terms of the performance. The UK did use them to some degree in cutting or silage swords, but there's virtually no use of the large leaf clovers in Ireland anymore, because of how aggressive they are and how they can smother out grass. We do have a grass and white clover recommended list, and I often talk about the grass recommended list. I suppose we don't often go into detail in terms of the recommended list there for white clovers, but they are published by the department each year in conjunction with the grass recommended list. It's available online, and I suppose we would be recommending that similar to grasses, when you are choosing your varieties, you should be using clovers that are on the recommended list in your mixtures. Most breeding programs and the recommended list as well concentrate on the above ground traits. So they're looking at clover proportion in the sward, looking at the yield of the sward. And I suppose just at this point, just want to mention, I suppose, the grass and clover breeding program that Germinal are involved with in Aberystwyth with the UK. And here they've also started to look at the below ground traits of the clover plant. And I suppose essentially what we're doing here is looking at the rooting systems. So one very interesting line of clover breeding is looking at crossing Caucasian clovers with conventional white clover, which is the type of white clover we're familiar with here, the Trifolium repens. And they have developed a new variety which is called Everlasting. Very closely related to the conventional white clover as we know it, but it does have both rhizomes as well as stolons in terms of its root system. So the rhizomes grow underground, and then the stolons grow, as I described already, across the ground. And I suppose what that does is the rhizomes bring a level of resilience to Everlasting, which wouldn't be there, we don't see to the same extent with conventional white clovers, in terms of their grazing tolerance, their cold tolerance. So we see at much cooler temperatures, the Everlasting can still actively grow. And we see better drought tolerance with it again as well, even though it's fair to say that where we have clover in the swards, even conventional white clovers, that those swards are more drought tolerant than straight grass only swards. I suppose just generally when you have all these good traits, there's generally a slight negative as well. But the Everlasting is slightly slower growing compared to what we do conventional white clovers. So it's slower to establish as well, and it doesn't yield quite as much as conventional white clovers. So that's kind of the drawback. But very, an interesting development in the breeding program, and probably something that we'll investigate more in the coming years. And there is some of that variety available this year, and it is being trialled here in Ireland as well.
So if people on the webinar hear of Everlasting again, let's say they heard it here first from you, Mary.
You heard it here first. As some have probably heard about it already, to be fair.
We'll claim it here.
We'll claim it here. And look, we also have coated white clover here in Germinal, and I suppose just briefly to explain what this is, because again this is something we do often get asked. Essentially, there's a coating on the clover. The clover on its own is quite a small seed. It's a very small seed, and the coating has some fertiliser in terms of phosphorus, which helps with the root development. And there's a bit of lime in there as well, and some rhizobium inoculant. And this just helps in terms of fertiliser and lime, in terms of as the clover seed germinates, it's kind of, the fertilizers, they're available for it to be used as it starts to develop its root. And I suppose what the coating does, it increases the size of the seed and allows better placement of the clover seed in the seed bed. It also makes the seed slightly heavier, so it's easier to get good sided seed contact. And I suppose this really comes into play for oversowing clover into existing swards, and especially for spreading that clover with a fertiliser spinner. And it allows more even spread of that, because naked clover seed won't throw that far out of the fertiliser spinner. But the coating does obviously add to weight. So 0.6 of a kilo of naked seed is equivalent to 1 kilo of coated or pelleted seed. And I suppose that's where, you know, for farms in irrigation, need to bear that in mind when they are including clover in the mixture. If you are using coated or pelleted clover, you do need to include 1 kilo compared to the 0.6 of naked. Okay.
Yeah, because as I say, it's such a small seed. The coating does give it that, you know, kickstart to develop, because it's for a very small seed. It's got a lot to do.
It does, yeah, absolutely, and you know, the coating does help it along, and you know, as I say, as well, it just makes it that little bit heavier, so it's you're kind of helps get a bit better soil feed contact. We do have a Clover Fix product here in Germinal, which is a 5 kilo pack of coated white clover. So you know, for farms and irrigation, that's allowing for 5 acres of reseeding. In terms of the management of white clover, look, I mentioned it already. Soil fertility is hugely important. Clover is quite a fussy little plant. It likes things to be right. You know, really need a good soil pH and P&K at index 3. And you know, we always say it. We say it if we're talking about grass seed as well. If your pH is low or your P&K index isn't quite where it needs to be, you know, focus on that before you start to try get clover or grass seed, as for that matter, sown on the farm.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, just Brendan put back in, he'd asked the question about clover that had disappeared out of the swards. He put down the P&K, I think, is at 2 and 3. So that, along with the pH, as you say there, they all need to be at that. If one of them dips, you will see the clover struggling. Yeah,
look, you probably will see it struggling. I suppose, you know, depending on whether it's low index 2 or you know, there's a bit of a scale there as well. You know, I wouldn't entirely put it down to just the index 2. That's mentioned there. You know, there's probably some other factors potentially going on as well, and maybe it's being grazed out. I suppose maybe the type of clover that's in the sward as well might influence it. As I say, the smaller the leaf, the more persistent the clover. So you know, that's just something to bear in mind as well.
That's great.
Now, when we talk about perennial ryegrass will kick off and start growing at 8 degrees, or at 6 degrees, I should say. White clover needs slightly higher temperatures, so 8 degrees is kind of where clover starts to get going and get growing. You know, and essentially, I suppose, you know, we tend not to see any you know, real significant clover growth until May, and hopefully we'll start to see growth of both grass and clover soon, because this year there's not much happening on either front.
Nothing.
So once temperatures improve, you know, from May onwards, I suppose, is where clover really starts to come into its own and starts to contribute to the sward in a meaningful way. In terms of timing of sowing, again, you know, we recommend, you know, April, May into June is an ideal time to sow clover and get it established on the farm. And especially, you know, where you're talking about full reseed or oversowing, because, you know, the clover then has a couple of months before we head into the autumn, months before, you know, soil temperatures start to drop and before air temperatures start to drop. And you know, once that starts to happen, so like sowing clover in late August or into September, you know, you're not going to give it the same start compared to if you sow it earlier in the year. Sunlight's hugely important, so, you know, maintaining light down to the clover, and especially, I suppose, you know, when we're talking about new reseeds, you don't want to build up heavy covers on new reseeds, because, you know, essentially that will shade out the clover to some degree. The clover will have to, you know, really throw a longer petiole to get the leaf up the height of the grass. And you know, it does affect the persistence. It'll tire out that little bit quicker. So, you know, maintaining light down to the base of the sward, getting good graze outs, you know, feeding out to 3.5 to 4 centimeters, and going in at, you know, 12 to 1,400 kilos of herbage mass is kind of ideal in terms of, you know, optimizing the clover in the sward. You know, use of clover safe herbicides is hugely important, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. When we talk about, you know, getting clover established as part of a full reseed. You know, I suppose luckily this year the department have come out and granted emergency use for clover safe post-emergent sprays, but also, you know, there are a couple of products that for established grasslands, such as the Eagle, a prospect that, you know, where you have clover in the sward, you need to mind it and use the right product.
Okay. I think that leads on to one of our questions there that came in earlier on. Clover is inclined to take over a sward and stops grasses growing. How can this be prevented? I suppose that goes back to your last comment there, that try to have the inclusion rate of clover at 25 to 30%, you know.
Yeah, well, the 25 to 30%, I suppose that's kind of the, you know, it's not so much the inclusion. I suppose we talk about maybe the sown rate of clover in a minute, but the 25 to 30% is the optimum proportion of clover in the sward to achieve the benefit in terms of, you know, animal performance, but also its ability to fix nitrogen and feed nitrogen into the system.
Okay.
You know, if clover, you know, if clover's, you know, starting to take over in the sward, you know, I suppose, you know, avoiding putting silage, you know, like, you know, or putting tight cuts of silage will impact it. You know, graze it and frequent grazing will probably help in terms of keeping the grass going. And you know, if the grass is growing actively and healthily, you know, it has better ability to compete with clover, where clover starts to dominate into the sport.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-on question there as well, Mary. On if there is old clover at a low level, do you try to encourage it, or would you be better to overseed it to try to improve the clover level?
Yeah, look, I suppose it's a kind of a difficult question to answer, probably, Sandra, without knowing how much clover is in the sward.
There already.
You know, you can oversow clover into it, and you know, your management of the existing clover and oversown clover, if there isn't enough of it there, you know, hopefully the combined inclusion of the oversown clover will help, you know, get the desired level of clover in the system. You know, if you have clover there, look, there are ways to manage it to increase the proportion of clover in the sward. But you know, it's probably hard, you know, maybe oversown clover into the sward will help get you to where you want to be that little bit quicker as well.
Okay, and the final one I have on that, just going back to your 25 to 30% inclusion, what seed rate Joe was asking to achieve that percentage in the sward?
Yeah, so look, we'll answer that question for Joe now over the next two slides. Where I'm talking about a full reseed versus oversown into an existing sward. And look, I mean, I suppose the easiest and most successful way we can get clover established is through a full reseed. You know, definitely when we're talking about oversown or stitching clover into existing swards, you know, we don't see the same take of clover in those. So, you know, if you want to get a reasonable portion of clover established on your farm, you know, including that as part of full reseed is the easiest way to do that. So look, you need to kill off the old sward, you know, cultivate to create a fine firm seed bed. And I suppose generally I'd recommend, you know, if you're disking and power harrowing, you know, from when you spray off to when you cultivate, you want to allow, you know, close on 3 weeks before you actually kill the ground. Okay, and that's going to allow full kill off of the old sward. If you have problems like docks in the field, it'll allow full translocation of the spray down to the root and to kill off the plant at the root. Okay, which is really important, especially where, you know, we have docks that have a well-developed taproot. They can be quite difficult to kill. And you know, removing as much of the surface trash as possible, probably about 10 days after sowing. So you know, you're either cutting away the old sward or grazing it to remove as much of that surface trash as you possibly can. And lime is hugely important, which will help counteract the acidity as the old sward dies back and decays. Okay, so the lime is really, really important when we're talking about full reseed in terms of, you know, creating an optimal environment for both grass and clover seed as it tries to establish. I suppose historically, a lot of seed mixtures out there would have had a standard rate of a half a kilo of clover included in the mixture. And you know, I suppose historically we weren't putting the emphasis on clover that we kind of are realizing now that we need to be placing on it. You know, a lot of mixtures out there now this year have the 0.6 or the 1 kilo quota clover again to tie in and to meet the irrigation requirements. And you know, that will result in a reasonable proportion of clover being established on the sward. If you really want to get a decent proportion, probably close to under 25 to 30% clover in the sward, then you probably need to go up closer on 2 kilos of quota clover in the mixture. And again, you know, most of the co-ops and merchants have that available as a special order, but they've no issue in terms of making mixtures with the 2 kilos of clover, which is, you know, ordered in advance. So, you know, on a per acre basis, then we're generally talking about 12 kilos of grass and 1.5 to 2 kilos of clover. You want to roll well post sowing, and the rolling will help both consolidate seed bed and also improve soil seed contact, and also maintain moisture in the seed bed, which is obviously going to be, you know, quite important. And you know, I think we've probably seen, or some part of the country has seen, a drought for the last three May June periods. So like that is hugely important. And obviously then following after with a Clover Safe post-emergent spray. Now we were in a scenario where, you know, the Clover Safe post-emergent sprays had been taken off the market, and you had until the end of October this year, if you had some in stock on the farm, to use them up. Just there over the last week, the department have come out and granted emergency use for products containing 2,4-DB or the likes of Clover Max, which is your Clover Safe post-emergent spray, and it's permissible to be used in a new lay. So that's
good news.
It's great news, Sandra, especially when we're doing so much to try to promote clover at farm level. So that emergency use has been granted from the 14th of May this year for 120 days. And you know, the spray will need to be used within that 120-day period. And look, that's going to bring us up to the 14th of September. I said it already, you know, there's probably no great point in going out with clover seed, you know, in August into September. So, you know, as I say, if you're trying to get clover established, best time to do it is kind of over the coming month or so. So, you know, when we're talking about, you know, the Clover Safe Plus emergency spray, timing of spraying is absolutely crucial. You need to ensure the trifoliate leaf is on the clover plant. So that's basically the 3 leaves are on the plant, and you want grass at the 2 to 3 leaf stage. You also want your weeds to be actively grown, but, you know, they still need to be quite small for these sprays to be effective. So essentially when you're, you know, for example, your docks are around the size of a €2 coin, that's generally a good time to go out and hit them with the spray. Leaving your spraying too late is going to reduce the chance of success, and you know, if weeds get established, it's much harder to kill them afterwards, especially where we have clover included in the sward, because you know the clover safe sprays for established grasses tend to be less effective. It's probably safe to say you're also trying to mind the clover there. So you know, time is important. Generally, it's around 5 to 6 weeks post sowing, but as I say, make sure the trifoliate leaf is on the clover plant, third leaf on the plant. And your weeds are about the size of a €2 coin. Okay.
Yeah, as I say, it's if you've gone to the bother of going to all of that work and you know getting the contractor in and spraying it off correctly, the key thing as well is don't forget that final step of post-emergent spray. It is key, and at as you say, the 5 to 6 week, watch out and be ready to go.
Absolutely, absolutely. And look, it's probably worth mentioning at this point as well. You know, that some people will ask about, you know, sowing their grass seed, going out, doing the post-emergent spray and following in with the clover afterwards. And in that scenario, it's really important to bear in mind that most of those sprays have a residual effect on clover. So, you know, probably the most common product out there is Pasture Trio or Envy in terms of, you know, new lay sprays. You have 4 months after you apply those sprays before clover can be included in the sward. So that kind of rules out your oversown clover this year. So the easiest way to get clover established is do it when you're putting in your grass seed. And use your Clover Safe spray. In terms of oversowing white clover, look, we're seeing a lot of interest in oversowing white clover in the last 2 or 3 years, and you know, probably more so than ever this year. So
yeah, there's a few questions come in, so they're all pertinent to this slide you have now, Mary.
I covered it off well, so
yeah.
look, you know, I said, I suppose, on the last slide, the easiest way to get clover established was as a direct reseed, but I mean, essentially we're only going to be reseeding probably 10% of the farm, if you know, or 15% of the farm, maybe if you're in a dairy scenario, and you know, maybe you know, dry stock aren't going to be reseeding at that rate. So in order to get a good proportion of clover across the farm, you know, it isn't viable for everybody to be doing it through a full reseed scenario.
Yeah.
This is where oversowing comes in. So with your oversowing, the weed control prior to sowing is absolutely crucial, and all those sprays have withdrawal periods. So it's important to pay attention to the label. They can range from 6 weeks up to 4 months, as I said already. And you know, so if you're doing your, you know, so I suppose it's fair to say, if you are planning on oversown clover, if you have a weed problem, do your weed control this year, and then hopefully next year you'll be able to go in and oversow your clover, okay? And that's probably the easiest way to do it and avoid problems, because you know, there's no point in putting out clover seed and having it and killing it before it even gets a chance to germinate and get going, okay?
Well, I've seen what you've described, Mary, where the spray went in too soon, and how we know that happened was because there was patches left, and they were the swing of the tractor with the sprayer. So the clover was in the parts where the spray didn't reach. So some of those sprays are very effective at taking out your clover. So as you say, sort the weed problem year 1 and do the clover overseed year 2.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So look, the ideal time for oversowing, again, it's generally, I'd say in April. Might have been a little bit on the cold side, the April we've just had. But you know, coming into May, you know, we should be going into ideal conditions. Hopefully we'll get a bit of moisture, and hopefully the weather will become a little bit kinder. So you know, it is an ideal time for oversowing clover. You need to have good soil visibility. So after the sward is grazed, for example, you need to be able to see you know, plenty of soil as you look into the sward. If you have a thick patch of grass, you know, or an old sward with a butt on it, you know, you're wasting your time oversowing clover. It's just not really going to get the chance to establish and get going in that type of sward. So, you know, in that scenario, I'd say, you know, don't waste your money on trying to get clover established there, because all you'll be doing is putting out seed and you probably won't see any great benefit from it. So ideally, in terms of oversowing, do it after a tight grazing, or maybe taking a cut of bales. Look, I said it already, it's not ideal to be putting clover into silage swards, so just bear that in mind. And I suppose there's two methods which we can oversow clover, either stitch it in, or the way you can spread it with a fertiliser spinner. Look, I suppose if you're stitching in, you know, you can use either naked clover or coated clover. If you're using naked clover, you probably want to go about 2 to 2.5 kilos to the acre. And when you're stitching in with coated clover, you know, you probably want to be up to 3 to 4 kilos to the acre in order to try to get that desired level of clover in the established sward.
Yeah, there was a question that came in that 4 kgs per acre looks a lot for oversowing.
Yeah, look, I mean, I suppose when I'm talking 4 kilos, I'm talking about coated clover. You know, and as I said, you know, you're allowing for some of the, you know, I suppose slightly less in terms of number of seeds, because there's, you know, a bit of fertilizer, a bit of lime, and a bit of extra weight on the clover seed. So, you know, and look, I mean, I suppose historically, you know, we'd often be talking about 2 kilos of clover in terms when we're oversowing. But look, I think, you know, from what we're seeing out on farm, in order to get the desired level of clover established, I think you need to probably be up to 3 to 4 kilos in terms of the coated clover per acre. You know, there's no point in, you know, only half doing the job when you're doing it. You might as well put it out, get enough established, and start to let clover fix nitrogen and do what it needs to do in the sport then. So if you're spreading it with fertilizer spinner, you know, mix it with a 0N product like 0730 or the likes. And don't mix it up in the yard and then travel down a bumpy lane. Mix the clover with the fertilizer in the field. Otherwise, what you have is clover settling at the base of the spinner as you travel down bumpy laneways or bumpy roadways on the farm, and you're not going to get an even spread. So again, with the fertilizer spinner, you know, mix it in the field with a 0N product like 0730 and spread in 2 directions. So go up and down the field and then go across the diagonal. And again, this will just help in terms of getting a more even spread of clover across the field. Don't try to do too bigger acreage at a time. You know, probably doing about 4 acres is probably enough, and then top up the fertilizer spinner if that's what you're doing. When you're oversowing, you know, we would recommend skipping nitrogen for about 2 rounds after you oversow, and probably reducing your nitrogen input thereafter, and grazing frequently. So, you know, if you're going out with fertilizer spinner, you know, or stitching in, for that matter, you're doing it immediately after a very tight grazing. Probably then come in, you know, maybe 10 or 14 days later again and graze it again. And basically what you're trying to do is check the grass, and just give, you know, get light back down to the base of the sward and give clover the best chance you possibly can of getting established. And, you know, for the next couple of grazings, I would be saying going in at low covers of, you know, around 1,000. Don't let the cover build up. Go in at 1,000. You're going to check the grass. You're going to slow down the grass a little bit. And you're going to make sure light keeps getting down to the base of the sward till the clover germinates and starts to get going. Okay. After you go with the fertilizers, if you're spreading with the fertilizer spreader, you know, as I said, you can go out with watery slurry, and that will help wash the clover down to the soil and help improve the soil seed contact. And you could give a roll as well if you want to. Okay. Okay,
just conscious of time, Mary, just for
Dermot
to be joining us.
Just my final slide here. Look, you know, when we do include clover in the mixture, and you know, when we get to that desired level of 25 to 30% clover in the sward, you know, really realistically, you know, from an economical and environmental benefit, you know, we do need to look at reducing the amount of nitrogen that we're spreading out in our fields. I would say, you know, in the spring, you know, clover isn't going to fix nitrogen, so, you know, maintain your level of fertilizer application then, and then, you know, reduce it thereafter. So whether you reduce it by 0.8 of a unit per round, skip a round, or spread less at each round, you know, there are different ways of skinning this cat, I suppose. Just as my final slide, I suppose, some of the key issues we see with white clover: poor growth in spring, you know, tactical nitrogen application, you know, front loading your nitrogen, I suppose, you know, and you know, doing front load is probably the wrong word to use there, but, you know, applying nitrogen in the spring as you normally would with the grass only swards, you know, will help maintain growth in the spring. Autumn closing as well, you know, don't close your, you know, the research has kind of shown us now that, you know, don't close your paddocks with a high proportion of clover early. Leave them until later in the round in autumn before closing. You know, and this will help avoid carrying heavy covers, which can reduce the persistence of clover. Clover can dominate and smother grass, so avoid silage cutting, as I've said already. We have small and medium leaf clover varieties. These are going to be more persistent and less aggressive in the growth habit. And again, tactical nitrogen application will help there. And bloat is also an issue, obviously, which we see out in farm. I suppose, you know, the risk here is when animals are going into a field with a high proportion of clover, when they haven't been on clover swords previously, and you know, maybe if they're going to hungry, if it's if it's wet, you know, that'll all increase the risk of animals suffering from bloat. So in that regard, you can include something like bloat oil in the water, put it in 24 hours before the animals go into the field with a high proportion of clover. Don't let you know one row of cows out first. You know, hold the cows back and let them all out together, so you know they graze down that little bit tighter. And also maybe just give them a 3-hour break, so you force them to graze down and to get a bit more fibre in from the grass plant rather than just selecting the clover in the sward. And that'll just and after 3 hours then drop the fence and let them across the whole thing when they have, you know, when you've taken the edge off their appetite, and that'll help as well. So sorry for taking so long.
Great.
Thanks for your time. And
no, you're grand. No, because it's answering some of the questions. So what we'll do is while you take down your presentation, Mary, I'll just look, and Dermot's putting up his, I'll just check some of the questions that we have. I think one from Patrick there, you've already answered. What and how do you recommend oversowing grass and clover to rejuvenate a pasture that's not bad enough for full reseed? So you've gone through that there in your presentation, Mary. One on a chickweed issue for what about starine application before clover germinates? I suppose what the farmer here, Joe, is trying to get the clover sorted, but you still have that clover germinating at the same time that the chickweed is germinating, I believe. Yeah,
you probably would. Yeah, I'd be a bit concerned in that regard. And look, I'm not 100% sure on that product. I suppose maybe just you know, pay attention to the label, or you know, seek advice from your sales rep there on that one.
Okay. Slurry by splash plate or dribble bar. I think you mentioned splash plate.
Yeah, look, the splash plate, basically you're going to get a bit more force coming out, and that's, you know, that's probably more beneficial in that regard. Obviously, you know, some farmers, and it has to be watery slurry. I don't know if I emphasize that, but watery slurry, you don't want to put out slurry that's going to cake on the top of the ground. So watery slurry is really important, and you know, obviously that's using the splash plate is going to be an issue for some farmers that are in derivation. But you know, that is the ideal way of doing it if you can.
Okay, there's a couple of others there, but I think we can leave them. Yeah, one technical question, maybe you'll know from the stores. This person would like to know the number of clover seeds that would be in a kg of non-pelleted seed.
Oh, that's a good question. I'll come back to you.
It's not a trick question.
When we're putting our email out next week, I'll have the answer for that question in the email. I need to go weigh some clover seed.
Okay, so we've just a few, and I think that the other questions there will tie in with Dermot's presentation. So thank you very much, Mary, and we'll get kick started. Dermot, you're talking about making the most of red clover.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Mary. As I said, my name is Diarmuid Murphy, and I'd just like to reiterate again what Mary said. Thanks a million to all for listening tonight. It's great to be involved with yourself, Sandra, and with Teagasc, and just be part of discussions, basically to try overcome, I suppose, farmers overcome some of the issues that are facing every day on farm. So listen, thanks a million for having us involved. So basically I'm going to talk to you for the next few minutes a little bit about red clover in terms of some of its key traits and benefits, keys to establishing clover, management in terms of how to ensoil it basically, or graze it, feeding it of red clover silage, and then a little bit about the breeding objectives and breeding progress in recent years. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay, there are a range of forage crops out there which we can introduce into our farms, regardless of whether we're dairy, beef, sheep, which will help to reduce costs, number one, improve performance, provide a traceable form of homegrown protein, and also at the same time reduce our carbon footprint. And we're all probably guilty from time to time of, well, farmers I think are sometimes guilty of looking for something new, something different. And reality is some of the crops have been around. They're some of the most oldest and most widely used forages, and have been around for years and years. And it's a case of the old dog for the hard road. So the likes of clover, the likes of our white clover. There's a reason why our fathers and our grandfathers grew these years ago. So yeah, sometimes we need to learn from the past.
Right.
Okay, so some of the advantage, it's nitrogen fixing, so similar to white clover, which Mary covered. It's a soil fertility builder. This is particularly important for your organic guys. It's the main reason they grow clover is to build the fertility of their soils and improve the soil structure. Yeah, it has a deep taproot as opposed to white clover. So even after the clover, the red clover has been incorporated into the ground, and even in subsequent years, you've basically got holes down in the soil from the taproot. Therefore, this will improve your drainage, improve aeration, as I say, and it'll just improve your overall soil fertility and soil structure. It also has advantages in terms of animal intake potential. I'll cover that in a little bit in a minute. That's because it's crude protein content. It's a form of homegrown protein, and a lot of the guys that ring us up that are considering putting in red clover, that's the one thing they say. They want a form of homegrown protein as opposed to importing feed.
Yeah.
Reduce greenhouse gas impact. Yes, it's for two reasons. If you're growing a crop of red clover, you won't have to put on nitrogen because it's a legume. It fixes its own nitrogen, so therefore you're reducing your nitrogen input. And it's a double effect because of its protein content. And I'll cover it in the next couple of slides. The protein content of it, it's true protein. So it's not bypassed, it's not excreted basically out the back end. So therefore you're reducing your actual, it's better for the environment because you're reducing your nitrogen output as well as your nitrogen input. It's very good in terms of drought. It's not drought resistant, right? I'd say it's more drought tolerant than grass, and that's basically due to its taproot, its long taproot going deep down into the deeper layers of the soil. And finally, it produces a lovely flower head. So it's very good from an environmental point of view for attracting bees and butterflies and various insects.
Okay, you're hitting all the right notes there so far, Dermot. We'll keep going.
Thank you. Yeah, it's ideal high protein silage for cattle or sheep. It's now being used in recent years, been more and more what they call it in grazing mixtures and multi-species mixtures. We have it in one of our own multi-species mixtures. However, it does tend to have a lower grazing tolerance than white clover, although it makes excellent grazing for someone who's finishing lambs or lighter stock aftermath grazing. So yeah, traditionally it was grown mainly for conservation with high yields, the ability to do 10 to 15 tons of dry matter. It'll do 50 if it's on low land with good soil fertility in terms of P and K and pH. It will do 15 tons. If it's on more upland areas, realistically, you're probably looking at 10 tons. Can be grown in mixed swards or as monocultures, and it's a little bit better than white clover actually in terms of its ability to fix nitrogen. It can fix up to 250 kgs of nitrogen per hectare. And to say 75 or 100 kgs of that nitrogen can be transferred to a companion crop, be it ryegrass or subsequent crop the following year. So there's a lot of residual nitrogen. So that's why I say the organic guys like it, because it's not just what nitrogen it fixes this year. It leaves that, if you incorporate it into the ground, it leaves that residual nitrogen, which can be then uptaken by the following crop. It contains phytoestrogens, which can cause hormonal disturbance in ewes. So it's just you have to be careful with breeding ewes or lambs not to graze clover 6 weeks either side of mating. It contains PPO, which is it's an enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, and basically that is I'll cover that. I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides, and that's basically the protein protection, which allows the protein in clover to be undegraded basically in the rumen, go straight to the abomasum, and basically that's why you get, in simple English, that's why you get improved animal intake and performance. So in simple English, that's what it does.
Very good.
It also has been shown to improve milk yields and live weight gain, and as I say, it's a source of homegrown protein, which is what a lot of people are looking for in the times we're in.
In reducing our carbon footprint in importing clover, this
absolutely
might be one of the options available to farmers to grow their own.
The reality is we're not going to be allowed to stay putting out the nitrogen that we're currently putting out. So from our point of view, we think clover, be it red clover, be it white clover, it's a train that's left the station, it's coming down the track, we've no choice. So we might as well
get on the train.
Yes, get on the train, and I think get on the train quickly, because at least then you know, like, do you know what I mean? You can feel your way and you can see, God, what do I need to do to suit my farm as opposed to somebody else's farm? Do you know what I mean? Learn I suppose, the pros and the cons of it, or the pitfalls, potential pitfalls. So at least then you're not basically what I'm trying to say is we should be proactive as opposed to being reactive, because we are going to be told in no uncertain circumstances we have to introduce clover into our soils.
Correct. And just while you're moving to the next slide there, Diarmuid, I just noticed, it could be by error, but a couple of our participants here tonight was raising their hand. If they have a question, just if they use the Q&A button to put in the question, and I'll be able to answer it for them. So thanks very much.
Okay.
Go ahead, Diarmuid.
I hope they're not raising their hand out to say I'm not saying something wrong.
No, no.
Okay, so from a persistency point of view, traditionally clover used to be grown for 2 years, 2-3 years max. They were the old varieties. And yeah, as I say, they struggled to last past the second season, and therefore they were uneconomic to keep them in the sward any longer. This is going back, as I say, to the 70s and 80s when clover was very big. Then there was also a problem, particularly in the UK, with pests and disease. I'll come on to them a little bit more in a minute. Clover rot and stem nematode, they are the main pest and main disease. They're both soil borne. So therefore they can be easily avoided through basically practicing crop rotation, same as a brassica crop, same as any crop. And as a result, several of the new modern varieties now continue to yield well into their 4th and 5th seasons, and also they have more improved crown resistance. Because basically, if the crown of the clover plant gets damaged at all, that's it; it will not recover. You can see in this picture here, this is the crown of the plant, and this is where all the new growth comes from in red clover plant as opposed to white clover. It can be very vulnerable to grazing, particularly from larger animals in wet weather. So you just need to exercise caution, and yeah, I suppose just exercise best practice. Just if it's lashing rain outside, just don't send in heavy stock. Just yeah, as I say, just mind it. It requires a little bit of TLC, I guess is the way of putting it. Okay, so just a nutritional comparison of red clover compared to your ordinary grass silage.
Yeah, because this is going to answer. There's a question in on this, so this is going to answer this for one of our attendees, Diarmuid.
Okay, so I'm not going to go through down through all the different parameters. I'm just going to try draw your attention to the crude protein content, right? So essentially, in this slide, the dry matter, the D value, the ME, and the pH and the ammonia are something similar, right? They're not drastically different. However, right, the crude protein is, I suppose, is the major one here, right? The average crude protein of grass silage, right, is 10 to 16. We'd say 10 maybe for perhaps pit silage. You might get it up as far as what they call it 16 for bales, right? For very good quality bale silage, right? Right. However, but even in that, right, there's huge variation in grass silage, and nobody probably knows that better than yourself, Sandra. When you're yes, okay.
We tend to see it lower, but we would prefer it if it was higher.
Yes. Whereas red clover, if you test the analysis on red clover, it consistently comes back higher in protein. So basically, the people that are making red clover silage are consistently hitting the optimum, hitting the target. And as I say, the big difference as well, what you got it in the crude protein content of both, right? As I say, I alluded to this earlier. The crude protein in ordinary silage, right? I suppose in simple English, but it's rapidly degradable in the rumen, right? And therefore, as much as 70% of that has the potential to be excreted out the back end, right? So, and if that's excreted out the back end in very simple English, it can't be converted into milk, it can't be converted into meat, right? So you don't want to excrete it, right? And it's not good from the environmental point of view, right? So there's nobody going to win. While the crude protein content in red clover, as I say, it's called true protein. It's undegraded in the rumen. It gets passed to the abomasum, and therefore it results in increased intakes and increased performance. So not only are you consistently getting higher crude protein silage, but that crude protein is true protein, and therefore it can be converted into milk or can be converted into meat. So that is the big, I suppose, selling point of red clover. Yeah,
the other good thing that I would have seen as well, on let's say weanlings going in for their first housing and put on red clover, that they grow, substantial frame. We would always advise, protein in the diet for weanlings to grow frame, to grow size. And I've definitely seen animals transformed inside out on red clover silage for them.
Yeah, so it does what it says on the tin.
Exactly. It's like Ron Seal.
Okay, just another slide. our breeding partners over in Aberystwyth, Ibers, this is just they did a trial basically where they compared red clover with ryegrass, and they looked at lamb performance. And basically, in terms of growth of grams per day, the red clover, it got 229 grams per day, while the ryegrass 182. Days to finish, you can see that they finished the lambs 9 days earlier, and basically they had better muscle depth, they had better subcutaneous fat, and the be all and end all, the kill out percentage was 48 versus 58. Sorry, apologies, it was 51 versus 48. So at the end of the day, that's what it's about for farmers. It's about making money. It's about how to hang up. And as I say, it does what it says on the tin. It's rocket fuel. Okay, so just a little bit about establishing it. It's all well and good saying that it's able to do these things. It's important to, you obviously need to be able to establish it correctly in order for it to achieve its potential. So it can be established conventionally. It can be established with direct drilling, oversowing. No more than any seed when you're putting it into the ground, you need a level, fine, firm, and fertile seed bed. My grandfather used to say the 3 Fs. That's how you knew a field was fit to be reseeded, if you'd achieved the 3 Fs: fine, firm, and fertile. They say the ideal soil pH for red clover is actually 7. Now, reality is that's not, you won't come across that too much on farm, but realistically, it does need to be 6.3, 6.5. It will certainly want to be above 6. So line well in advance, as I say, if you feel that you're hoping to incorporate clover into it next year, the year after, go out there now and as I say, make sure take a soil test and put out lime. P and K, a little bit like lime, would say, as per soil test results. So you have to make sure from a cost compliance point of view. But basically your 10-10-20 or your 18-6-12. Don't put it down any more than 5 or 10 millimeters, not too deep. And it's, as Mary said earlier on, it doesn't particularly like cold conditions. So although grass growth might kick off at 6 to 7, realistically you're talking closer to 8 to 10 degrees for clover. So to say May, end of July, mid-August, they tend to be the best times to put it in. If it runs any later than mid-August, well, it just, you tend to have a drop in temperature, and it's basically you have a less chance of getting it established.
That's great, Dermot, because the question that came in there was just, well, I suppose it was titled what land would be suitable, but the land needs to follow all of those points that you're after outlining on that slide. To get the clover establishment.
I'd say it's easy for us to say, but would say if it can be as fertile land as you have, right, and free draining, because as I say, if it's subject to waterlogging or subject to poaching or treading, will not work with red clover, because you'll damage the crown. That's it. What you got to, or even if you're not going to graze it, if you're coming in onto to kind of damp or cooler land with heavy machinery when you're making silage or anything like that, if it damages the crown, that's it. That's good luck. It's not as, I suppose, as resilient as white clover. Although there are breeding for more robust crowns, you just need to, as I say, exercise caution. So I'd say free draining, as fertile ground as you have, south facing obviously will be warmer. As I say, your best ground, I'd say. That's where I'd be trying to target it. Just a couple of key points. Control the weeds. Mary, as I say, alluded to these earlier on, or covered these earlier on. Control your weeds before you oversow your clover. Remember that some of the herbicides have up to 4 months of residual. Ideally, after first cut silage or a very tight grazing, as I say, late May, July, August, after maybe your second cut of silage. Moisture is very important, particularly if you're oversowing it. And basically, don't put it down too deeply. I've had 1 or 2 people that rang us in the past, and they said that they put it down too deeply because they were worried about drought. But the issue is, it went down too deep. It's a very small seed. It's not like white clover. It's not pelleted. So therefore, it tends to go down deeper because it's smaller. And if it goes down too deep, if it goes down 1 inch, for example, as opposed to 1 centimeter, I'm sorry, it'll never come. It doesn't have the energy. It doesn't have the vigor. Can't compete. And you do need an open sward. So make sure that soil is visible, and make sure that there's no thatch. Like if there's a lot of thatch there, you'll struggle to penetrate down through that, get good soil to seed contact, and therefore you'll struggle to establish it.
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, it's sorry, apologies, I'm after skipping one of me. Yeah, it can be grown as a monoculture, or also I suppose more commonly it's grown along in conjunction with ryegrasses to make high protein silage. It also by putting them in along with ryegrasses, or be it Italians, be it hybrids, be it perennials, you're improving the ground cover of it. Right, it's not as open, so therefore you're reducing the risk of poaching or treading by livestock, and also reducing the risk of damage by machinery. And they say that the highly digestible grasses, so your high D value, your high quality grasses, they help to mop up the protein. As I say, they're basically a companion crop. And remember at the start of it, I said 75 to 100 kgs of the nitrogen can be passed on to either the companion crop or the subsequent crop. So really, they are best. Although they can be grown as a monoculture, it's probably best to put them in with, as I say, with a ryegrass, in order to, I suppose, to make the best of it, essentially.
Okay.
If it's going in on its own, 6 kgs to the acre, as I say, that's not usually the case. More often than not, it goes in with grass. So you're looking at 3 to 4 kgs of clover, 10 to 12 kgs of grass. So you're looking at somewhere between a 13 and a 16 kg mix to the acre, yeah. And then if it's longer term, as in if you're hoping for it to last 4 to 5 years, which the modern clovers are capable of doing, well, you're looking at using intermediate or late tetraploids, as opposed to traditionally, when it was only in the ground for 2 to 3 years, it tend to go in with more Italian type ryegrasses. As I say, but because now it's longer, it's lasting longer, people are leaning towards using hybrids or using intermediates and lates. And if it's for silage, use a tetraploid. In terms of grazing, they say 1.5 kgs of acre red clover along with white clover, and maybe 12 kgs of grass. And as I say, if it's for grazing, it's more probably important to use a diploid as opposed to a tetraploid. Diploids are very good for density, they're very good for persistency, so that helps from a grazing point of view. Tetraploids are very good for yield, they're very good for quality, so that obviously lends itself to silage. And as I say, lastly, multi-species. And as I say, we do at Germinal have a multi-species mix which contains red clover. Okay.
Very good.
Okay, so just a little bit about conservation in terms of the do's and don'ts.
A question come in. I think the first question tonight came in on this, and I knew we had a slide on it.
I kind of feel sorry for him. He had to wait 11 slides for me to answer his question.
I hope he's not gone.
I hope we haven't lost him in the meantime. Okay, so they say you should graze the swards lightly in the autumn of the sowing year. Okay, as I say, lambs are ideal, or the lightest stock you have, whatever they are, that's what I graze it with.
Okay.
In terms of the first cut of silage, you should target between the 20th of May and the 1st of June. And traditionally, it's used to say when 50% of the flower was put, 50% emergence of the flower. Although there was research done recently at Teagasc in recent years. Sorry, apologies, not at Teagasc, at Aberystwyth in the UK, over at Ibers. And basically, they're saying now that from a quality point of view, and also from in terms of to prolong the persistency of it, or the longevity of red clover as long as you can, that the minute it flowers, the minute you see a red flower appearing, that's when you should go in and cut it. So it's probably leaning towards 20th of May as opposed to the 1st of June. Okay. Avoid crown damage with tractors and mowers. As I say, crown damage, it's detrimental to the plant and it simply cannot recover. Allow plant to fully flower once per year. Yeah, so they say that at the end of the year, so perhaps in August, September, or maybe even depending on the year, it could be early October, you could be taking your very last cut. And they say whenever your last cut of silage is, that's when you should allow it to 100% flower. So all you want to see is pure pink or pure red across the entire field. And basically, when you come in then with a mower and you knock that, some of that seed or some of that flower or seed will fall onto the ground, and it just helps the persistency of it. It helps it to self-seed, essentially, in simple English.
Right.
Do not mow below 7 to 8 centimeters. Yeah, again, that's the crown. As I say, the crown is at that height. If you mow below that, you're mowing below the crown, plant won't recover. As I say, good night, Irene. And yeah, that's basically
just a question on there's a question in there on the wilt. You're probably coming to it there now, so I'll get Mary to answer it from a white clover point of view, but they're looking for it from a red clover point of view as well.
Okay. Well, here I'll do is I'll go through this slide, and if I answer it well and good, and if I don't, hit me with it afterwards.
I will.
Okay, so 3 to 5 cuts at 6 to 8 intervals, 6 to 8 intervals is what the target should be. Aim to wilt down to 35% dry matter, certainly 30, and they say you should use a rubber more conditioner. If you don't have a rubber more conditioner, perhaps consider using no conditioner at all. It's just if you use a conditioner, what you got it, you're basically going to increase leaf shatter, and you're going to increase leaf loss. Leaving the swat, do not ted out. Yeah, now if you don't have a conditioner, you might have to ted out. But if it's mowed with a conditioner, definitely don't ted it out, because basically, it'll result in leaf loss and leaf shatter. Avoid excess wilting. As I say, this will also result or lead to leaf shatter. And in terms of just offtakes, right? So to say for every ton of dry matter produced, and to say typically that your first cut silage will probably produce 5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, and as I say, it has the ability to do up to 15 tonnes altogether. So that means your other 10 tonne is probably spread out over your other 3 cuts. So you could be talking maybe 5 tonne, maybe a 3.3, 3.3, 3.3. But for every tonne of dry matter that's been removed, to say it's 8 kgs of phosphate and 27 kgs of potash per tonne. So that's what you need to be putting back. And it's like anything, you get out of it what you put into it. And I'd always say this is a red clover side, but from any silage mixture, the one thing that never ceases to amaze us at Germinal is when you get a soil test, if you speak to someone that has a silage field, a specifically dedicated silage field for 3 or 4 years, and to go away and the soil test it, it never ceases to amaze us how quickly you will drop your P's and K's, because people don't realize that for every ton they're taking off, that's how much P and K is coming along with it. So you need to put back what you take off.
It's a bit like making a fruit cake. If you don't put in the fruit, you don't get a fruit cake. So if you don't put in the P and the K, you won't get silage.
Yes, or your wallet on a Saturday night in the pub, although none of us have been in a pub on a Saturday night. You'll get over what you put into it.
Exactly. Now, when you're talking about the excessive wilt there, Diarmuid, yes. What do you mean by, what do you call it excessive?
They say don't leave it any more than 36 to 48 hours max.
Max, Grant, that's great. That's answering one of our questions. Thank you.
If it was in good, like if it was good sunny weather, I'd say perhaps even 24 hours. Maybe what you call it, as I say, if it was mixed or poor weather, maybe 36, but certainly no more than 48. Absolute no. Because I say it just ends up. But even if it doesn't appear like you have a lot of leaf loss or leaf shatter, what'll happen even when your baler or your silage wagon comes along afterwards, it'll end up doing it. So it may appear like you might say to yourself, God, it's still. I'm looking at it out there, and it's after being. For example, say you didn't have a rubber conditioner and you ended up mowing with a non-conditioner mower, and then you ended up spreading it out and raking it up. And you'd say, God, it doesn't look too bad at all. What do you call it? I'm happy enough. It's after getting 36 hours. But then you could find that even when your baler or your silage wagon comes along, what do you call it? It'll end up kicking and damaging it. And essentially, you could even when you're trying to, as I say, trying to bale it or trying to put it into the wagon, you could end up doing damage. So as I say, 24, 36 hours ideally, certainly no more than 48.
Yeah, because that might answer a question. I'm fair. Does clover hold a lot of moisture? I noticed the bales of silage were extra heavy, so maybe the wilt wasn't sufficient on them.
Yeah, and it does. It certainly hold. It certainly does hold. Like at the end of the day, it's but depending, as I say, the target is 35%, 30% dry matter. Realistically, if the wilt wasn't, if you didn't achieve that wilt, it would be quite heavy.
Okay.
Okay, so just a couple of tips in terms of grazing. They say it's ideal after mat grazing, especially for lambs or lighter stock. We went through the growth rates that's possible to achieve. Just avoid grazing in wet conditions in order to avoid bloat, but more importantly, to reduce poaching and therefore crown damage. Because as I said, once the crown is damaged, it's more subject to the disease as well. But basically, it's just not going to recover once the crown is damaged. I said this already, that it has high levels of phytoestrogens, so just affects ovulation and ewes. So avoid grazing breeding ewes and rams 6 weeks either side of mating. And bloat, a little bit like what Mary said, basically just limit access when the stock are first introduced. Don't turn them out into a clover-rich pasture when they're hungry, and feed fibre, hay, silage in order, what you call it, just basically to satisfy their requirements.
Great.
Okay, good news is I'm coming down the home straight, Sandra. Okay.
Yeah, we're a little bit after 8:30, but thanks to everybody that has stuck with us. We're nearly there.
I won't delay him too much longer. In terms of potential pitfalls, as I say, back in the 70s and 80s, clover was huge. Red clover was huge in this country and particularly in the UK. Not so much anymore, right? So the truth is, there's not. We always mention these pests and diseases, but they're not very common because there's not a huge amount of clover in this country. Or red clover in this country. But basically the clover rot, which is called sclerotinia, it's the most common. It's a fungal disease, and basically it rots the leaves, stems, and the plants don't recover. But what increases the risk of this particular clover rot is when the crown is damaged. So again, it just I probably
TLC.
But just I keep coming back to do not damage the crown. Stem nematode, most common pest, as I say, soil-borne. So basically what you do is you practice crop rotation, and if you do that, shouldn't be a problem. So 1 in every 5 years, and extend it out to 7 if there is a problem. Okay, just a little bit about the breeding objectives going forward and the breeding progress. What they're looking at now, Mary spoke about this earlier, they're looking at stoloniferous red clovers, which they say will be absolutely revolutionise the red clover in both this country and the UK. Basically has similar growth characteristics to white clover, so therefore it'll persist. As I say, traditionally the biggest issue with red clover was that it only lasted into its 2nd year, maximum 3rd. So if you can get red clovers to persist 4, 5, 6 years, as I say, it's groundbreaking stuff. Higher yielding than white clover, so not only are they fixing more nitrogen, but they're also yielding higher. Grazing tolerant, as I say, they're breeding for more robust crown. And the PPO is basically the protection of the protein and lipid protection in the rumen, which allows it to go straight into the abomasum, and that's what gives you your increase in animal intake and performance. Another thing they're looking at in terms of is pest and disease. They're looking for they're breeding for improved pest and disease, and also quality. They're continuously trying to improve the crude protein and the crown survival. So as I say, there is progress being made, and I'd say watch this space, because as I say, clover is it's a trend that's coming down the track, be it red or white. So in summary, the soil, like any seed bed.
Sounds like you're having a glass of wine there now, Diarmuid, red or white.
Yeah, I wish. I might have one tonight when I go home though. So in summary, when you're trying to establish any seed, it's key to have good soil, good seedbed. So remember your 3 F's: fine, firm, and fertile. A balanced mixture. Practice crop rotation. So I say 1 every 5 years. And when it comes to grazing, beware of bloat, and also beware of breeding ewes and rams. And most importantly, avoid damage caused by poaching to the crown. In terms of conservation, monitor the cutting dates. So as I say, the 20th of May is probably when you're going to be looking for your first cut, and then cutting heights. So don't cut it any lower than 6 to 7 centimeters. Sorry, one thing I should have mentioned earlier on, Sandra. Right, I say do not cut it below 6 to 7 centimeters, right? But only throughout the winter months, they say that it's not good to carry a high cover of red clover. So only in the winter months, when you're grazing, when you're doing the final grazing or the final cut of the year before the winter months, you can go down to 4 to 6 centimeters. But normally they say 6 to 8 centimeters when you're cutting for silage. So it's the only time of the year that I'm giving you permission to go down to 4 to 6 centimeters is when we're coming into the winter months. Avoid damage caused. Yes, well, thank you. Avoid damage caused by machinery. And finally, when it comes to picking a red clover variety, you should be looking at yield, so the highest yielding varieties. You should be looking at quality, so in terms of crude protein content and mineral content, red clover is very high in both major and micro minerals. And I suppose persistency. At the end of the day, what you got at the higher it can yield and the more persistent it is, well, sure, the more financially viable it is to put it into the ground. So
great job.
That's it in a nutshell.
Another great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you. Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, Sandra. Go on. Mention you something there.
Say, for more information, visit Germinal.ie, and upcoming webinars in the month of May. We'll come back to you with definite dates as soon as they've been nailed down. But we are hoping to do 2 more presentations, 2 more webinars, 1 on multi-species and 1 on brassicas. And as I say, we will be in contact via email as soon as we know more and we've nailed down the exact dates.
Great. All right, that's brilliant. I think we've covered a good few of the questions, but I'll just double check. We just have a few minutes before there's Patrick there has put in a reseeded paddock last year and used Arborgain. He's very happy with it. He's going to oversow or clover. Question is, does clover perform better in tetraploid grass swards rather than diploid? I think you answered that. The answer is yes. The tetraploid is tall and erect, so there's more ground cover there available for the clover rather than the diploid.
Yes. The only thing I suppose to come in at that, and I hope I'm not jumping across you, Mary, I guess it might depend whether he's hoping to graze it or whether he's hoping to. Red clover, as I say, as a general rule, tends to go into silage mixtures. If it's Abrogain, right, and it's probably going to be in the ground for the next 7 to 8 years, perhaps white clover would lend itself better. It'll tolerate grazing better. So yes, tetraploids do allow you to incorporate red clover because they're open, yeah, absolutely. But as I say, if it was for grazing long term, you'd probably be looking at white clover as opposed to red clover.
Question from Mark for you, Dermot, on does the taproot in red clover increase mineral in the sward?
Absolutely. As I say, I just said it there at the end, it's very high in crude protein and minerals, your major micronutrients. So because of the taproot going down, as I say, not only is it making it more drought tolerant, right? Not
a miracle.
I'm not going to say drought resistant, yeah, but it'll make it more drought tolerant. As I say, it'll improve drainage generation. That taproot going down so far. And it also, because that taproot is going down so far, it's scavenging nutrients. So it's not just what you call it water, it's not just moisture, it's also scavenging your major micronutrients. So yes, it will certainly improve the mineral content of your companion crop.
Okay, question then still on the red clover. What's the best grass seed to put in first to allow for spraying and oversowing of red clover afterwards?
Well, as I say, if it's red clover, you're probably going, I'd say it depends on whether it's going in for grazing or cutting. Now, as I say, 9 times out of 10, it ends up going into cutting mixtures because it just, as I say, it lends itself better to cutting as opposed to being grazed. But if you're looking at putting in with a cutting mixture, I'd say depending on how long you're hoping to have it in the ground, for example, some organic guys use it as a fertility builder and they might only put it in the ground for 2 years. So if they were looking to only putting in the ground for 2 years, you're probably looking at an Italian type ryegrass. Again, it will be a tetraploid, but you're probably looking at your Italians. While if you were hoping to put it into the ground for 3, 4, maybe even 5 years, well then you're looking at either your hybrids, or if you're looking to produce the maximum quality silage, you're looking at your perennial tetraploids. So be it intermediates, which are your abracloids, for example, of this world, Dunluces of this world, or else your lates, which you suggested, or you said already, Sandra, your Abrogains, and for example, there's new variety this year in Grace Hill. So I'd say if it's going in for a silage scenario, look at your tetraploids and look at your perennial tetraploids.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, but still some valid questions I just wanted to put to you. Red clover going down this year from an anonymous attendee here. Can I show in a barley, or can I put in, I'd say, a barley for an arable silage, or should I leave it a year or forget about it?
It's very popular in the UK to incorporate red clover in the spring, or to undersow red clover with barley. But as I say, then they end up, that's when they use it, what they call it, as a break crop. It's very big. They say it was absolutely huge back in the 70s and 80s over in the UK, but it is making a resurgence because they're using it as a break crop in the UK. So they undersow it in the spring to barley. So yes, that 100% can be done. But I guess if you want to put it in on its own, you can undersow it with like your spring barley. But if you wanted to put it in with a companion crop, as in your Italian or your hybrid or your perennial grass, you'd be best to put it in, as I say, just with the grass.
Okay, and a one answer question here. Brendan has been growing red clover for 15 years. What varieties are the longest lasting for Irish conditions that you've seen, Dermot?
I suppose there's in terms of the longest lasting, I'd say Aberclawit is probably, they said it can last 4 to 5 years. Only we're having a little bit of an issue with it at the moment. In terms of what they got, we got affected by the drought last year, and it didn't yield quite as good as we wanted it to yield, and as a result, it's a little bit short supply basically. But there's also lemon, and there's agile, which is another one that has been around. I've seen a good bit of it. But I suppose, yeah, your Aber varieties, to be fair to him, there was an Abercanty, it's now gone, but Aberclarity, I suppose, is probably the longest lasting. That I have seen in the ground lasting 4 to 5 years.
Okay.
That's as long a shelf life now as I've seen get out of red clover.
That's great. There was a question there on nutrient offtake in comparison to grass. You have that answered in your presentation already. Somebody's thanking us for a great information. Thank you for sticking with us. And just seeing, does rolling damage the red clover crown, Dermot?
Yeah, say that you should ring roll it, yeah, or Cambridge roller when you're sowing it. But after that, I would not come in with a roller. No, not for soil. But hopefully, Sandra, if you're only grazing it, right, rolling traditionally is used, obviously, berry stones, which before silage, right, that are after being brought up by livestock grazing in the autumn and in the fall and in the spring, right. But if you're only grazing red clover with lighter stock, so lambs or calves, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. Like, do you know what I mean, with an uneven surface? So, excuse me, there shouldn't be a need to roll red clover after it is sown.
And can you use an overseeder to put in the red clover?
Absolutely. Once it's but make sure it's an open sward, make sure that you see soil, there's no thatch, and put it on with P and K. So like what Mary said about white clover, 0730 or 01020, yes, it can be done. And just come in then with light stock and keep it grazed. If you have some watery slurry, that'd be great. But come in then with light stock and keep the grass down, like, because you're basically what you're trying to do, you're trying to suppress the growth of the grass and you're trying to boost the growth of the clover. So how do you do that? You put on P and K to get for root and leaf development. You don't need nitrogen. So as I say, watery slurry maybe, and that's all. And as I say, just keep the grass down, keep the grass down, keep the grass down.
Okay, so 1 or 2 questions there from Mary. Do I need to use slug pellets in an oversowing stitch-in situation, Mary?
Yeah, look, I mean, yeah, slug pellets probably will help when you're stitching in to establish graft, yeah.
Okay. We covered, there was just methods of successful blow control, but both of you have gone through both of those in the presentation in how to avoid that and to use different techniques in when you're putting in the animals. There's couple of questions there that people have asked about mixing the seed with watery slurry and spreading with the splash plate or the trailing shoe. If either of you want to answer those, that'll be our last question for the night.
No problem. It's something that people ask us every year, even when it comes to either Italian ryegrass or clover. They talk about, can I mix it with my slurry and can I put it out with the splash plate? You can, absolutely, right? It's hit and miss though. Right? I'm not stopping you from doing it, but you don't expect to get 100% take. Like, you're never going to get 100% take when you're trying to stitch in anything into an existing sward. Because, as I say, you're trying to ask one crop to grow and you're trying to ask the other crop not to grow. So you're never going to get 100% establishment, but you're definitely not going to get it if you use a slurry plate, because there's no guarantee, Sandra, you're going to get good soil to seed contact. As I say, so that's what the stitching in machines and the oversowing machines and the fertilizers, that's what those machines, those specific machines are for. They're designed to open up the sward, cut a slit in sward, place down the seed, get good soil to seed contact, and roll it afterwards. A slurry tank doesn't do that. A slurry tank is designed to, do you know what I mean? So you can do it, but just whatever about grass, if I was going to the trouble of trying to incorporate clover, what they call it, is expensive. It's usually retail 10, 11 euros a kg, 12 euros a kg, maybe, depending on the size of the bag that you're getting. So I'd be trying to give it every chance possible, as opposed to mixing it into a slurry tank and chucking it out. Great. 2 brilliant presentations. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Dermot. And from all the questions that have come in, you've answered them brilliantly. So hopefully those that have asked questions have got their answers and that everybody enjoyed our presentation. Sorry for running over. Always seems to happen. We try to keep time, but the questions keep coming in. And sure, if that's what you need answered, that's what we're here for. So thanks to everybody, and watch this space for the next webinars in May on multi-species and on brassicas. So to everybody, have a good night. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Mary.